Okay, great. All right. Okay, so let's I'm gonna jump in. I'm gonna go straight into the model actually, um, rather than do kind of the background of the model. Um, here, I want to kind of address one or two things here. Um, Mental illness, I'm going to get into mental illness, but essentially, what is our ultimate function or purpose of our lives, right? It's at the end of it, it's to gain salvation in the akhirah, right? At minimum, it's to be able to enter Jannah and to be free, عتق من النار, right? To be free from the fire of Jahannam. On a more higher level is ma'rifatullah, right? It's to be able to worship Allah as if we see Him from ihsan, and ta'budullaha ka'annaka tara, right? To worship Allah as if we see Him. So kind of to have a deeper connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to enter the highest kind of state and the highest Jannah, and to kind of have this union in the end, right, with Allah Ta'ala. And so, along this pathway that we're going along, we're going to have barriers that stop us from being able to reach that destination. They may be spiritual pathologies, right? Then we need to facilitate, then we need to do something in order to intervene, in order to get rid of those spiritual pathologies, so that that doesn't stop us from getting to our ultimate goal. But one of those is also our psychological barriers. What I mean to say, so there's a fiqhi maxim, right? There's sort of a kind of a principle in Islamic law that goes ما لا يتم الواجب إلا به فهو واجب. That anything in which the means that are required in order to fulfill some obligatory act, if they're required in order to fulfill that obligatory act, then those means themselves becomes compulsory. And so in our fiqh discourse, we also have actually theologians where they've debated this issue of wujub al-tadawi. Is it mandatory to seek treatment or not? And some fuqaha have gone to the extent to say that it is absolutely mandatory to seek treatment and sinful otherwise, unless the treatment is not proven to be effective. So it's mandatory if it's proven to be effective and that it's going to facilitate your well-being. So junun, like mental illness or insanity, right? In Islam, is not matlub. It's not ideal. It's not a desirable state to be in. And so to be mukallaf, to be responsible, and to be able to relate to Islam as you should, then we need to be able to treat those things to remove those barriers. So I just want to kind of note that that's our schema of health. Like the pathology is anything that serves as a barrier and stops us from our ultimate purpose. Okay? And mental health pathology can be broken down into two types. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi kind of, really talks about this. Pathology could be endogenous or exogenous. Endogenous means that it's internal, it's more biochemical, okay? It's more heredity based. Exogenous is more environment based. And Abu Zayd al-Balkhi says, which is very consistent with kind of today, obviously there's a huge continuum here, right? They're not like completely discrete categories. But there are loadings, more internal biological mental illness, then there's more environmentally based. So example, internal, more of a bipolar schizophrenia, okay? Or could be a schizophrenia, intellectual disability. Environmental, more of post-divorce, trauma event, loss of job, pandemic, etc. Okay, something in the environment puts undue stress on you and you get sick. Okay, now this is important to answer the question that I brought up before. How does spirituality relate here? Well, on the biological, spirituality doesn't really play much of a role. It may enhance you a little bit, but you could be a waliullah. You could be like super God conscious, but still be sick. Why? Because it's biochemical. And Abu Zayd al-Balkhi says this is where psychiatric, pharmacological interventions become almost necessary, right, in these instances. Then you have exogenous, which is more environmental. And what he recommends is the hikmah of a hakim, talk therapy, cognitive interventions, psychological interventions in thinking differently. And on the second one, spirituality plays a huge role, spiritual intervention and coping. And that's why I think there's a nuance here, right? People say, mental illness means weak iman. Not necessarily. It may be the converse. A person may have high iman and their suffering leads them to be elevated in their rank, actually. And it purifies them even more. So they may actually be rising in their ranks. But the converse can be true, though. It's a more complex answer, right? Because mental illness can be bio-heavy, it can also be psyche-heavy. And psychological is also a metaphysical part of us. Right? And so therefore, mental illness in some cases can be lower iman. I will acknowledge that. It can be lower iman. And by raising it, we may raise mental capacity and psychological coping, right? Obviously, it's not, because of the complexity, we don't want to make these blatant comments and categorize everyone, paint everybody with one broad brush. But that's, that's my answer to kind of addressing that question, because people kind of fall on two sides of the equation here, but rather it's more of an integration. It's some of both, right? There is a relationship with spirituality and psychology and mental well-being, but not always, okay? Come right to our model here. So, a way to be able to understand the human psyche. This is our model in TIIP of understanding the human psyche. How does the human psyche work? Well, we have these primordial kind of drives. We have the fitra. كل مولد يولد على الفطرة. Right? Everybody is born upon the fitra, meaning that they are born good, that they have the capacity to understand truth, to follow truth, to understand universal good concepts or morality, tawheed, the oneness of Allah, right? They have this fitra, but they also have these other drives as well, which is your angelic drives, the one that wants to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, malakuti kind of drives. And then you also have your hedonistic, satanic, and aggressive drives. So this is your shahwa, right? Hedonistic is your shahwa. And aggression is ghadab, right? Now these, by the way, these two, hedonistic and aggression, or we should say appetitive drives, are not inherently evil. They're not bad. In and of themselves, they're not bad. Okay? In their excess, they're bad. Meaning that everybody needs to eat to survive. Everybody needs to sleep. Everybody needs comfort. Right? People have sexual drives and impulses. Those are normal. And to nourish those bodily needs are necessary for survival. Aggression drives, the survival instinct, needing justice, becoming angry, protective faculties are embedded within the human being. And so these are very natural. The hedonist, the aggression or aggressive, ghadab and shahwa. But in their excess, when we do those in excess, they become competing drives. They work against each other, right? So we have these two poles. وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. Right? That the nafs, and by the way that we fashioned it, it has the capacity for taqwa, it has the capacity for evil. Now, we have this so those are just kind of the drives up top. Now when we look at the psyche is composed of qalb, aql, ruh, nafs. And we've just added ihsas. It's more of a secondary phenomenon. It's not a true part of the metaphysical, but we added it as part of the model. So you have aql. The qalb is the center of it all, meaning all health and pathology manifests in the heart. كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. That the heart rests on account of what they earn. Yaksibun is not just action, it's what they've earned. It's what you do, more than just action. It could be even thought processes, right? So qalb, يوم لا ينفع مال ولا بنون إلا من أتى الله بقلب سليم. That nothing will benefit us except that we will come to Allah with a clean heart. So the goal is to purify the heart. Okay? But, and this is why psychological and spiritual are actually interwoven here. Okay? They work with one another. You have the aql. The aql is your thinking, your rational faculties, your thought processes. Ruh is your spirituality. Okay? Is your spirit. And the nafs, here we translate as behavioral inclinations that are wired with these two drives of appetite and aggression. Appetite and aggression. Okay? So what do we need to do with all four of these faculties in order to ensure that we have a sound heart? The aql, we need to feed it good thinking, healthy thinking, sound belief, and good optimistic thoughts, realistic thoughts, coping thoughts, all of these things. And so how do we do that? Through ta'aleem and tafakkur. We exercise the aql. And then we end up with what? An aql mutafakkir, right? Like a thought, that a mind that is knowledgeable and contemplative and reflective, right? The ruh, what are we going to do? We're going to feed it with dhikr so that it reaches ruh al-malakuti or ruh samawi. We have this idea of the ruh samawi. This ruh that inclines to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We want to feed it. The nafs, what are we going to do? It has these drives. We call these behavioral drives, bad behaviors, habits, right? That it might incline towards. If you don't train it, like the horse analogy, if you don't train the nafs, it's going to start to go out of whack. It's going to have pornography addiction. It's going to have eating addiction. It's going to have lethargy. It's going to have lifestyle issues. It's going to be aggressive and have anger management issues, right? So what do we need to do? We actually need to go against mukhalafa, go in opposition to those drives and moderate our diets, moderate our behaviors, push ourselves to do those healthy behaviors that are necessary for us. If you have an issue with being angry and feeling entitled, right, then what we're going to do is we're going to ask you and prescribe for you selfless behaviors. So it's going to agitate you and hurt you in order to become normalized and trained such that you don't feel that agitation anymore. And then you reach what? Nafs al-mutma'inna. Now we can conceptualize any patient this way. Okay? We can conceptualize. Let's take a look at this. You can have a depression. Predominantly, you look at the, by the way, the principle here is we're going to use i'tidal, right? So I'll come to this. But let's take a patient. Let's take an example of a patient. A patient who has depression. They have negative thoughts, pessimism about themselves, low self-confidence, and they view the world as stressful and difficult. Okay? And what happens? Let's just jump to behavior. They feel, oh, you know what? I'm deficient. I'm not going to be able to, I'm going to go to hell anyways. There's no point in me even doing anything. What happens? Behaviorally, they don't pray. What happens? Emotionally, they feel sadness and a void and disconnection. What happens? They have a disconnection, spiritual disconnection with Allah Ta'ala, and they feel a sense of a meaningless void. Here they feel sadness and depression. Here they feel a meaninglessness and disconnection. Okay? And you may even see in their behaviors some ways of trying to self-medicate. They may overeat, right? They may be excessively glued to social media in their depression. So you see all these behavioral kind of manifestations: sadness, depression, negative thinking. Okay? And so what we're going to do is intervene on any one of these, predominantly the one where the main problem lies, and we might work here because they kind of have some negative, pessimistic views and thinking, and we're going to work with that, okay, to change that. Let's take another example where we have more of a nafsani problem, pornography addiction. The person otherwise has healthy thinking. However, their main issue is that they get involved in pornography addiction. What happens? Overindulging in sexual gratification, they start to feel initially excitement, right? But and then what they do is they rationalize, they make excuses for why they should be engaging in this behavior, and then they commit sin and they have a spiritual disconnection. Also, what ends up happening here, that's during, right? But after, what happens here? After they're done with their pornography addiction, engaging in their addiction, what do they feel? They feel shame. They feel depression. Then what happens is that they start to think that they're useless, and they feel really guilty, and they start to judge and criticize themselves. And then what happens is they end up continuing this perpetual behavior, and they still have this spiritual disconnection. And actually, we know there's a relationship with looking at the wrong places and the quality of your salah, spiritual connection. And we know that in Islam, there's traditions to support that notion. So therefore, they can't even pray properly or concentrate properly. Their khushu goes out the window. Let's take another problem. Now, that's a more behavioral problem. Let's take an example of somebody who has an emotional problem. Trauma, okay? They have trauma issues. They've been sexually molested as a child, unfortunately, and they cannot regulate their emotions. They dissociate a lot. They tend to feel something triggers them, and they start to feel an intense amount of fear that starts to creep in, okay? And panic or re-traumatization, potentially, right? When they get triggered, maybe they're watching a movie, something, and and something triggers their memory, right? And neurons that fire together. What happens is those fire, and when they end up becoming emotionally disconnected, then what they might do is that they might cognitively disassociate, right? So they start to disconnect and disengage, right? They start to numb out cognitively, right? Or sometimes they might view themselves negatively. They might criticize themselves and feel they're dirty, ugly, or so on and so forth. They may withdraw, checking out behaviors. They start to disconnect from their relationships when they're in this moment, okay? They may have difficulty in actually even having, let's say they're married, to be able to perform sexually, right? Because of the fact that they've been kind of, the trauma has really created a problem here for them. And then spiritually, they may be in a position where they start to judge themselves spiritually, and then they start to disconnect by even dissociation and not engaging with the deen. Or they may even have these thoughts of, why did God let this happen to me? Existential issue, and then they spiritually disconnect. Okay? So all of these things can be, now we can look at a purely spiritual problem. A person is otherwise doing just fine in other areas of their life, but what they have is a meaninglessness. They're not praying at all. They're not engaged in any, spiritual activities. So they feel this void. They don't pray. They, feel a sense of sadness and discontentment with life. And then this also impacts their thinking. So you can see how there can be a main problem across these. And these are the steps that we take with every patient. So we want to get them from the clinical range. Sometimes it may be clinical issues. Sometimes it might be spiritual pathology. It may be a mix of both, right? but we want to get them out of the clinical pathology. Usually indicated, clinical is indicated by lack of functioning. They can't function in life anymore, right? And then get them past this to the normal range, and then to connect even higher with Allah Ta'ala. Here are the main ingredients of our model, Inqiyad, in the beginning, we want to kind of build an alliance. This is a practitioner, build a relationship with the patient. This engenders the compliance and motivation in the patient to want to work. Then we have mukashafa. We start to help them uncover and introspect about themselves. And then they start to understand their own problems, their deficiencies, health, vicious cycles, the relationship between all these components. Then once they do, we start to be a bit more directive. We start to intervene, and we have i'tidal. Sometimes there's problems here. The nafs, you're engaging in too much aggressive behaviors. So then we're going to prescribe non-aggressive behaviors. You're engaging in too much of this. So we're going to prescribe behaviors that go against that. Emotions, what we want to do is regulate your emotions. Maybe you're emotionally overactivated. We want to underactivate it. It's i'tidal. Maybe over here what's happening is that you're thinking too negatively, pessimistically. We want to get you to be more optimistic in your perspectives. Maybe here you've become like a monk. You've disconnected, you're not marrying, you're going into the, you just want to kind of get involved in religious activity, and that's great, but it's not, there's no monasticism in Deen. So we want you to counterbalance and say, you know what? Spirituality is also through your relationships and getting married and so on and so forth. So once we get this equilibrium, i'tidal, then we go to muwasala, we get continuity of care, and each of these functions start to integrate together and serve their ultimate purpose to engender a qalb salim. And obviously this is aspirational. This is like, it's happening throughout a lifetime, right, for us. And then at the end, I just wanted to show you just another just illustration. Here's an example of one of my patients. And I'm going to kind of end on this here as an example. Here's let's do this one. So 33-year-old working professional woman, married with 2 kids. She has mixed anxiety depressive disorder. What's the situation? I'm just showing you how you can categorize, classify each patient according to this methodology, right? And work with them. So the mom wants her to come over every single day. She has children, and she's like, I miss my children, I miss you guys need to come over. So enmeshment. Mom is kind of wanting an enmeshed relationship. What's happening here? Let's look at all across these domains. On the aql, she is between personalization versus villainization. Meaning that mom so she thinks, mom is judging me, and she thinks I'm bad, I'm hurting her, I'm sinning. Therefore, what does she do? Let's go down to behavior for a second. Behavior, what does she do? She starts to enmesh. She visits mom excessively, overcompensatory behavior. She goes there every day. But then what ends up happening? She starts to feel anger and irritation. I can't get my life together. I can't get my work done. This is ridiculous. I have my own family and I need to do, I can't even spend time with my own husband. I don't know, where did it go? Just kind of jumped. Okay. And there's a jinn in my slideshow, So then they go to anger. And then what happens is, you know what? Religion's too hard. I'm going to go to hell anyways, so I'm not going to pray. I'm not even going to go, so this is not useful, because she thinks that religion requires her to respond every time mom tells her to come over. Okay? Now, on the flip side, what she does is, okay, you know what? I'm not going to go. This is ridiculous. I'm just going to stay home. And she thinks, mom is, mom is bad. Mom is, she starts to villainize mom. Mom is overbearing, etc. What happens? she avoids and doesn't go to visit mom at all. And then she starts to feel what? Guilt and shame, right? And then she feels, oh my God, I'm disobeying Allah and I'm feeling a lot of shame and guilt and I'm going to go to hell. And there's disconnection with Allah. Do you see what I'm saying? So you can see how you can kind of do this, and we want to moderate, help her moderate by working with this patient. And obviously I'm doing a gross oversimplification of working with patients in mental health care settings. But I just want to kind of give you guys like a skeleton, right, of how to think about mental health